Alright, so let's go on to three more movies from this year, and we're kind of in more of the animated and family-friendly territory for all three of these. And let's start with Paddington in Peru, because I'm a little late to the party on this one, obviously. But I had heard that, because obviously the first movie kind of surprised everybody as to, like, how creative and, like, warm and just of a good quality that it was in general. And then Paddington 2 came out, and it's Paddington 2. It basically speaks for itself as far as its reputation now. So this one was coming from a pretty steep level of expectations, I guess. And I had heard coming into it that those expectations were not met for a lot of people. Not that this one's like bad necessarily, but when you see the reputation that Paddington 2 has now and the way people react to it, this one doesn't even really come close to that particular territory. But like I said, that's so high. That doesn't necessarily make this one like terrible by any means. And I don't think anybody's saying that. So yeah, we're seeing what middle of the ground Paddington looks like basically. So I think one thing that probably plays a part in that is a new director with Paul King not being a part of this one. I'm going to assume he was working on Wonka at the time, and that's why. I feel like I remember this kind of going into production around the time Wonka was a thing. I don't know how much they actually lined up, but long story short, it's a new director, and I think you can really tell. So there's actually a few new things going on here. We also have Emily Mortimer in place of Sally Hawkins, which is interesting because, not to say Sally Hawkins doesn't leave her own sort of impact, but it's almost like Emily Mortimer is one of those people that you're kind of surprised wasn't already in the Paddington world, that she fits in so seamlessly. It's kind of, you kind of see her and it's like, it's kind of, it doesn't really take you, at least it didn't take me out of it, that they had replaced Sally Hawkins with her. So and I don't know if it's just because, obviously I have a love for Mary Poppins Returns, so I'm used to Emily Mortimer and Ben Whishaw kind of being in the same world anyway. So, especially like this sort of, fantastical world. So, that was something that honestly didn't really take me that much out of it, when that's something that might typically in a franchise. And one thing that did occur to me quickly was, it was interesting, and I don't know if this is intentional or not, it has to be, that it seems like they were trying to set a record for how many times can we say the title of the movie in the first 15 minutes between the characters, and especially between Jim Broadbent and Olivia Colman. Broadbent, who's only here for like a quick moment just to remind you that he exists, and then Olivia Colman playing a major part here, who, much like Emily Mortimer we just talked about, maybe even more so, is another person that you're like, I'm really surprised she hadn't been in the Paddington world yet, because she fits so seamlessly into it. And it is fun to watch her. She's probably the most fun of like the new aspects to the franchise, whether it be like her deliveries and like the constant smile that she has no matter the context of the scene. And it's like the whole time you kind of assume she's a villain, and then like they kind of turn that on its head, but then they kind of turn it on its head a second time as it goes. And it's like, and it seems like it's really obviously starting to go one way, and then it eventually gets to another point. It's a very interesting character, and it's fun to see Olivia Colman have fun with a character like this. And another person we're bringing into this, of course, is Antonio Banderas, who is our more upfront villain of the story, who's very... You'll notice another one of the weaknesses of this movie is you can tell that they kind of knew the success they had with Paddington 2 in regards to people's reactions to it. So it feels like there's a lot of Paddington 2 carryover, whether it be character dynamic or having a villain like this with Banderas, where he feels very similar to the Hugh Grant character, where he has practically voices in his head, and he's playing like a bunch of different characters because he's seeing like ghosts of his ancestors in his mind. It does remind you of Hugh Grant playing like the different characters as he did his little heists and all that. and just how insane it showed that he was. It does feel like we're kind of going back to that, even though I do love Antonio Banderas, especially in, like, hectic environments like this. Like when he was in the second SpongeBob movie. Where he's kind of got that sort of similar energy again. It's also kind of like how when he was in that Uncharted movie for like 2 seconds, and it's like this is him sort of getting to do a little bit more of what that potentially could have been, but just in this sort of much shadier sort of role. Another thing here is there is a noticeable amount of slapstick in this one, which might not register right away because obviously the Paddington movies have a lot of slapstick in them anyway. But like one that immediately comes to mind, of course, is the barbershop scene in the second movie. But the thing about it is the barbershop scene in the second movie has a sort of domino effect to what's going on in the plot. It's what eventually, really eventually, it leads to him being imprisoned because of the whole judge thing. So there is a sort of effort in the slapstick where not only does it work, where there's something practically artful about the slapstick, typically, in the Paddington movies, but then those also happen to, like, domino effect into whatever happens next. There's not really a feeling of that here. It more just feels like it's just slapstick for the sake of the chaos, for the sake of, like, low attention span children that might be watching or something like that. Like there's a moment where he wrestles with a hammock, and it's just a scene, and it feels very, it doesn't, there's a magic quality in those previous movies that is missing from this one, where we can recognize the style and what we're doing as far as, like, comedy goes and the different types of comedy. But it feels like a slightly emptier version of those as we go. And like, it gets closer to the slapstick of the other movies when, like, there's a sequence where he's, like, on an unmanned boat. That feels a little closer to what we're probably looking for. And the other thing is about them being on a boat and in the jungle and stuff like that, looking for El Dorado. It is, like, those other two movies feel like they're in, like, their own magical world, and, like, their own unique thing throughout. And this one does feel like you just dropped Paddington into a typical jungle adventure movie. So there's really nothing about that unique world quality that really stands out in this one. So there's that. There's, like, running jokes here and there that are funny for a little bit. There's one in particular involving Hugh Bonneville and a spider. And what sucks about this is it has a setup, and then there's one payoff when they're in the water, and he, like, grabs, like, a picture of it, and it freaks him out. And that's funny enough in the moment that it feels like basically the payoff. But it becomes such a running joke eventually that when it gets to its final, for sure, this is what this joke has been building to pay off, it feels like it's lost its luster by that point. So that was kind of disappointing, where it's like when we had a reveal where he actually comes face to face with this real spider, feels like it should have been a much bigger laugh than it actually was. But yeah, so that's a little disappointing. But that sounds like a lot of negativity. The thing about it, though, is that this one is still quite likable. It's very difficult for a Paddington movie to be unlikable or to, like, sort of be heavily criticized, and not just in the way of going easy on it because of what it is, but like I said, there's still, that quality here, and they still find a lot of it, even if it feels lesser. A lesser version of what the Paddington movies typically are, on a scale, is still pretty good. Because, like I said, because the quality has already been so high up to this point, a lower tier version of it is still above average for movies of this sort of, like, in this area. So, yeah, and it did, I guess another thing that feels kind of weak is, the big emotional payoff is, once again, a reunion with Aunt Lucy. And it's like, this is like, you already used this as your big emotional payoff, so we kind of yeah, that's kind of used up at this point. So when it happens again, like for this movie, it feels like the emotional resonance isn't there. So, and I'm somebody that wasn't as, insanely moved by Paddington 2 as most of the world was. I still really like it and can acknowledge all the great things about it and why they are. But it didn't have like that, like a life-changing quality to me that a lot of people seem to have. But I now that I see this movie, that also seems to highlight of what was working so well and what maybe a slightly lesser version of those things looks like, and that's pretty much what this movie is. But once again, that's still okay. And I love a lot of what Olivia Colman's doing as well, so there's that. So let's go to Dogman, which I didn't have a lot of expectations for because, as it turns out, I thought I knew Dogman better than I did as like a character and that whole world, because I did grow up having like, some of the Captain Underpants books and knowing that whole thing. And so I guess just at some point it got into my head that I just kind of knew who Dogman was also, but after watching this, I don't know that I did, at least very well. I might have known who Dogman was in passing, but this really familiarizes me with him now, because the reason I say this especially is because I don't think I knew the concept of Dogman, because if I knew the concept of Dogman, I would have absolutely remembered. Because this concept is insane for the kind of movie that it is. For an animated, family-friendly, silly movie, the idea of a dog and a cop being in an accident and the dog's head is put on the cop's body, and that's who Dogman is. That's fucking nuts. In the best way. And it's right there in the title. I mean, Dogman, it's 2 words. Like, when I was thinking in my head, it was always 1 word. It's 2 words. So the title itself tells you, the character's name tells you who and what he is. So there's that. And you can even, like, see his stitching the whole time. And there's even a RoboCop moment where he goes home and, like, has his memories still intact, but his house is empty now. And it's really, there's a lot of things that are surprising about this movie in really good ways. So, and it does have the Captain Underpants vibe, obviously, but still, there were a lot of surprises here. His nemesis is a cat, naturally, named Petey, who is voiced by Pete Davidson. So once again, it's like another one of my favorite pastimes on this channel at this point is talking about how underrated I think Pete Davidson is, and this is yet another excuse to do that. And he's like, the arch nemesis, so we get the whole montage of them, like, of him, like, escaping and getting caught over and over again, and they have this real, like, comic book hero and comic book villain sort of relationship going on. We have all the words on the screen, like, a typical comic book hero movie, or like, a comic book in general. And there's one of my personal favorites was, we get an exterior shot of Petey's lab, and he's, like, evil giggling. And on the exterior of the lab, we just see, like, he come on. And just stuff like that throughout. Just the whole vibe of the movie just pulls you in really quickly. It could probably seem like a lot, but like, if you are familiar with the Captain Underpants vibe in general, you're ready. And I did know that there was that connection, so I felt ready for how, like, insane and busy and chaotic this was all going to be. And was much better off for that. And yeah, and so it's just gonna throw, it's one of those things that'll just throw jokes at you constantly. Like the, when he says, something's not fair, when, Laura Howery's cop says that, life's not, like, something's not fair, and then, his superior says, here, call this number, and you call the number, and it's just a guy that says life's not fair, and hangs up. And that's his sole job. And just jokes like that have so much, like, me explaining it just now took a lot more time than the joke lasts. It just goes really quickly. And stuff like that I really love. And it's also a lot of, like, big build-ups for really small punchlines. And it's like, once you can come to appreciate that as it goes, like, it might seem like, oh, I thought there'd be more to that, or, oh, I thought this would, oh, these jokes don't seem to be landing as well. Once it occurs to you that the idea, like the running gag is big build-ups with small payoffs, then you kind of start to appreciate them more as they come. And it's always like, you can never tell if something's going to have a big payoff or not, or if it's going to be one of those things that's just a little tiny payoff that barely pays off at all. And just the unpredictability of that is also really fun. And there's also stuff like stuff that is senseless just to be fun being senseless. Like this wonderful exchange that Petey has with this girl who wants to buy... He clones himself, and now he has Lil Petey he's trying to get rid of. And he just says free kitty. Just anybody can have it. And this person says, oh, I only have $1. And the exchange that follows is wonderful. And just so wonderfully absurd, which is how you could describe most of this movie. There's a very hyperactive reporter, voiced by Isla Fisher, who mentions in passing that she once had a gerbil named Colonel Kurtz, the Brando character from Apocalypse Now. That's a joke that I love. And then you got other characters that come in that are crucial, like Stephen Root as Petey's dad. And this is when the movie kind of gets into interesting emotional territory, because in movies like this that are this busy and chaotic and, you know, sort of geared towards certain audiences, you imagine that the emotional resonance will only go so far, typically. So the emotional payoffs in this are surprisingly... There's like a genuine sweetness throughout the movie, but there's also like... By the time we get to the end especially with the sort of... The end of this particular story with Petey's dad comes to has like... They're like pretty mature emotional payoffs, and the way the characters deal with them, and how some things just sort of are, and you just sort of live with what happens, and you have to move on and kind of start your own sort of happiness, is a big factor in this movie, in a really surprising way. I was really loving that stuff, and how much it was really actually coming through all the comedy and all the chaos and all the silliness of it, and actually hitting and actually like landing. It was, yeah. And I think another thing that helps also is that for Petey to be like the big arch nemesis, and then to eventually have the inevitable moment where he's gonna grow attached to Lil Petey eventually. But the fact that that typically comes at the end, and it's typically unearned, and it's just sort of tacked on to have a moment where the villain goes soft, but the moment comes pretty early. That we haven't even introduced a new villain yet, I don't think, and he already sort of gets his own attachment. And then they kind of set up that there's like this sort of three-way attachment going on, where Dogman's now attached to Lil Petey, and Lil Petey is attached to Dogman, but now Lil Petey was already attached to Petey, and now Petey's starting to get attached to him, and there's just a whole thing here. And that becomes like a conflict throughout, and it's not just a last-minute, oh, the villain's going soft thing. So that I really appreciated also. And then, yeah, we do get our sort of major actual villain, who is a fish voiced by, like, half-robot fish, voiced by Ricky Gervais. For most of the movie, I thought Ricky Gervais was Richard Ayoade. Either one is fine. But so that's a lot of fun also. And, yeah, and like I said, it's just constant jokes and just this constant hectic nature, but it's always, like, it doesn't lose that energy throughout, shockingly, and it's always funny, and like I said, being able to slip in those genuinely emotional moments that actually pay off in between all of this is really skillful. So I really appreciated all that. They even had time to throw in one of my sort of guilty pleasure jokes that always works on me every time. The character with the unexpectedly high-pitched scream is just one of my favorite jokes ever. It never fails for me, and so I loved seeing that one again. So, yeah, that's the surprise that Dogman was. So, let's end on Plankton, who got his own movie, which I only learned this very recently, like shortly after Netflix put it up. And I remembered that Sandy had gotten her own movie last year, but then I forgot about it, so I went back to it before this. And I had kind of heard that the Sandy movie was a disaster, and that it basically is. There's a there's a lot going on in that Sandy movie, and most of it probably doesn't work. And it's definitely, I still can't get used to this computer animation we've gone to ever since, as far as movies go, Sponge on the Run. Like, Sponge on the Run really didn't work for me, and I think a lot of it stems from what it looks like, and it's just like, it just doesn't have the SpongeBob vibe to me. But then again, I'm somebody that grew up on a certain era of SpongeBob and haven't seen God knows how much now since it's still ongoing. It's still branching off into other things. But it's... The last time I, like, really cared about SpongeBob was that second movie, Sponge Out of Water, which I still love. And that was, like, the last time it felt like the SpongeBob vibe was really there. And, like, the humor and all of that. So, and the characters the way they once were. And so, like I said, just jumping into these movies now and knowing that everything's been going on since and all these spin-offs and all the other stuff, I feel like I'm getting dropped into God knows what. So, that's... the Sandy movie did eventually get to a point to where I started to finally sort of appreciate just how insane it was. And I don't even know if that's a good thing necessarily overall, but especially after watching Plankton's movie, I kind of started to miss the insanity that was the Sandy movie. Even if the Sandy movie wasn't working, it was going for something. It was swinging for the fences in some weird-ass way that the Plankton movie isn't. The Plankton movie feels pretty generic. So I'm basically, I guess, getting caught up as much as I can on these movies, given that I also recently learned we're getting a fourth SpongeBob movie in December. So there's that. Still sticking with this same animation vibe, I guess. So, like I said, it just doesn't really feel like the SpongeBob that I knew. So I'm trying to get used to it, but I don't think that's going to happen. I'm just going to watch these movies and then move on. Talk about them and then move on. But we do start with something that's kind of promising, where I almost was getting Lego Batman vibes from the opening, when Plankton's basically directing the opening of the movie, when we get, like, the, you know, different shots and all that, and, like, the introductory shots and all that. And, yeah, Plankton's saying, like, you know, do this, and he's doing the whole thing. That's very much like the opening scene of Lego Batman, where we hear Will Arnett basically directing. But then, like, but still, it's something we've seen before, and that's basically what it's going to be. The stuff that, like, mildly hits here is stuff that just kind of is driven by familiarity more than, you know, any sort of cleverness. So, this one also has so many songs in it. And SpongeBob has always had songs, for sure, but they were also typically used sparingly. Like, you know, every few episodes of SpongeBob might have one song of some kind or something. But this movie's basically a musical, and all of them feel like filler. And a lot of it is Plankton's backstory. Like, it's focusing on Plankton and Karen, and it's basically a Plankton-Karen origin story. So we see, like, how they met, and how they, you know, how their marriage formed, how she started off as a potato, and then grew into a computer as they went. We had that one line, I can't remember which episode it's in now, maybe the first one one of the first ones Plankton was in, where Plankton gets kicked out of the Krusty Krab and he's flying back over to the chum bucket and he yells, "I went to college." And, like, ever since Plankton said that line in that early episode, they have milked that with Plankton's character, this whole he went to college thing. So we get to see him in college. We're still milking that one line that he said that one time. And so that's, like, a whole segment of the movie. Not only is it a whole segment, but in the present day, he and SpongeBob have to go back into the college to get something as a plot point. So it all feels very like we're milking everything we possibly can. Like the way they had a whole episode that ruined the My Leg guy. And they did that in the Sandy movie. They milked the My Leg thing again, even though they already devoted an entire episode to it, supposedly. That was long after I was watching, but I had heard that there's a whole episode devoted to the My Leg guy. And that's just a terrible idea. And it's like you can see where they're starting to really stretch things out, which I heard has been going on for quite some time now, but now that I'm watching these movies, you can really see it here, too. If we are continuing to compare this to Sandy's movie, I will say I do like that this one has a lot more SpongeBob in it. Because in the Sandy movie, SpongeBob is basically her idiot sidekick. And it felt like he was barely there. In this one, it does feel like we're kind of revisiting the partnership, if you can call it a partnership, that SpongeBob and Plankton had in Sponge Out of Water, where it's like they're, I would say antagonistic. It's one-sided antagonistic, obviously, because Plankton hates him and SpongeBob's oblivious, but still, that vibe feels like it's kind of back, and that's a relationship I'm always fine with. Obviously, the episode when he's trying to get SpongeBob to turn evil at the beach, it's like the real sort of blueprint for this, the Be Assertive episode. So it's always nice to see them doing that, even if it does feel like it's something we've seen before. And there are there's callbacks, like the mind control helmet makes an appearance. There's a moment when Plankton has like handsome gas that he's sprayed with. It's just a really quick throwaway joke. And the handsome gas makes him look like handsome Squidward. And it's like, that may be less of a callback to handsome Squidward and more just a recycled joke. Like, just, that's what handsome looks like, is the chiseled face. So a lot of this just feels like weak and bland and forgettable. And like I said, a lot of it is songs that just feel like filler. So, like I said, I was really starting to miss, like, the crazy shit that the Sandy movie was doing, even though it wasn't good, and none of that are choices I would have said are good choices, but it's like, at least it was doing something. At least it was being weird. And that's the thing, and SpongeBob has always excelled at being weird. That's like what made it popular in the first place. And so the Sandy movie may have gone about that in a misguided way, but at least it was trying, I think. This one feels very lifeless to me. It is funny that this is purely accidental because they came out around the same time. There's an aspect ratio there's a fighting joke where the aspect ratio changes, and that's a joke that was also in Dogman. So that was weird to see practically back to back. So it is with Karen basically becoming the villain and becoming like this Hydra of being 3 computer heads with 3 different personalities. It is nice to see, like, Jill Talley get to play Karen, but get to play, like, different characters at the same time, so that might have been fun. But, yeah, overall, there's, like, just nothing inspired in this one. But it's, like it's not, like, bad or, like, terrible. There's just really nothing to take away from it. Like I said, at least the Sandy movie gave you something to talk about. Even if it was, being flabbergasted of how a movie like that could have possibly happened and how many bad choices could be made. But like I said, at least it was trying to be weird. And this one's just, this one just is here. It just exists. Like, it's almost like it's just killing time for kids until this next movie comes out in December. So, which is still quite a long way off. So, that's what they've got to deal with. So, luckily, I feel lucky to have had the SpongeBob that I had in 99 to like 2003 or 4, maybe even 5. So that's how I feel about these. So yeah, so Dogman is my takeaway from this one. So the next 3 things are probably going to be the Jason Statham movie, the Iowa Debris movie, and The Rule of Jenny Penn is something I'm really interested in, so I really want to track that down as well. So that'll probably be the next 3, and then we'll go from there. So until the next thing, I think that's it.